The morning of December 7th, 1941 began like any other Sunday in paradise. Sailors on the USS West Virginia were still in their bunks, some had gone ashore the night before, and the ones who remained aboard were looking forward to a lazy morning on the calm waters of Pearl Harbor. Down in the galley, a 22-year-old black mess attendant named Doris Miller was collecting dirty laundry from the officers' quarters. It was the only job the Navy would give him. Not because he lacked courage, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the color of his skin determined that he would spend his service washing dishes, serving food, and cleaning up after white officers. The United States Navy in 1941 had a policy as rigid as steel. Black men could enlist, but they could not fight. They could serve, but they could not lead. They could die for their country, but they could not defend it with a weapon in their hands. Doris Miller knew this. He had known it since the day he walked into that recruiting office in Waco, Texas, a farm boy who wanted to see the world and serve his nation. What he got instead was a mop and a dish rag. But on this Sunday morning, everything was about to change, and a young man who was never supposed to touch a gun would become one of the most decorated heroes of the entire Pacific War. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. The sound was unlike anything anyone had ever heard before, a screaming roar that tore through the peaceful Hawaiian morning like the hand of death itself. Japanese aircraft swarmed the sky, their rising sun insignias glinting in the tropical sunlight as they unleashed hell upon the unsuspecting American fleet. Torpedoes sliced through the water. Bombs tumbled from the bellies of dive bombers. Machine gun fire raked the decks of battleships that had no time to respond, no time to even understand what was happening. The West Virginia, a 32,000-ton battleship moored along Battleship Row, took the first torpedo within minutes. Then another. And another. 7 torpedoes in total would strike her hull, each one tearing massive holes below the waterline, flooding compartments, trapping men in the darkness as the sea rushed in to claim them. The ship began to list, tilting violently to port, threatening to capsize entirely and take everyone aboard down with her. Doris Miller was in the middle of his morning routine when the first explosion hit. The ship lurched beneath his feet. The lights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, men were screaming. He didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He did what every sailor is trained to do. He ran toward his battle station. But when he arrived, he found it destroyed, blown apart by a Japanese bomb, twisted metal and fire where he was supposed to report. So he did something else. Something that would define not just his life, but the lives of countless black servicemen who would come after him. He made a choice. He ran toward the chaos instead of away from it. He ran up to the deck where the battle was raging, where the sky was black with smoke and red with fire, where men were dying every second. And when he got there, he saw his captain, Mervyn Benyon, lying on the bridge, mortally wounded by shrapnel, blood pooling beneath him, still trying to give orders even as his life drained away. Miller didn't hesitate. He and another sailor grabbed Captain Benyon and tried to move him to safety, tried to get him below deck where the ship's doctor might save him. But Benyon refused to leave his post. He kept shouting orders, kept trying to coordinate the defense of his dying ship. Even as his voice grew weaker and his skin grew pale, Miller stayed with him, shielding the captain's body with his own as bombs continued to fall around them. When Benyon finally died, Miller looked around at the carnage, at the men scrambling in every direction, at the Japanese planes that kept coming in wave after wave. And then he saw it. An unmanned Browning .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun, just sitting there, loaded, ready, and completely against regulations for him to touch. The Navy had never trained Doris Miller to fire a weapon. They had never trained any black mess attendant to do anything but serve. But Miller had watched the gunners on the West Virginia practice. He had seen them load the ammunition belts, seen them track targets, seen them fire. And now, with his ship sinking beneath him, with his brothers dying all around him, with enemy aircraft screaming overhead, Miller made a decision that would echo through history. He walked over to that gun, sat down behind it, and opened fire on the Japanese planes attacking his ship. The Browning .50 caliber is not a forgiving weapon. It kicks like a mule. The noise is deafening. The heat from the barrel can burn your hands after sustained fire. Miller had never fired one in his life, but he learned fast. He swung the gun toward the diving planes, led his targets the way he'd seen the trained gunners do, and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared to life, spitting tracer rounds into the smoke-filled sky, and he hit them. One plane, then another. Witnesses would later report seeing Miller shoot down at least 2 Japanese aircraft, possibly as many as 4 or 5, though the chaos of the battle made exact counts impossible. What was certain was this: a black mess attendant who had been deemed unfit to fight. who had been relegated to the galley because of the color of his skin, was now one of the most effective defenders of the USS West Virginia. He fired that gun until the ammunition ran out. He fired until his hands were blistered and his ears were ringing. He fired until the order came to abandon ship, until the West Virginia was sinking so badly that staying aboard meant certain death. Only then did Doris Miller leave his post. Only then did he help other wounded sailors into the water, pulling them away from the burning oil that was spreading across the harbor, swimming them to safety even as explosions continued to rock the fleet. When it was over, when the Japanese planes finally withdrew and the smoke began to clear, the scene at Pearl Harbor was apocalyptic. The USS Arizona had exploded and sunk, taking 1,177 men with her. The USS Oklahoma had capsized. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. Nearly 200 aircraft had been destroyed. The Pacific Fleet had been devastated in a single morning. And in the midst of all that death and destruction, a black mess attendant had become a hero. But America wasn't ready to hear that story. Not yet. Not the way it really happened. When the Navy first reported the events of Pearl Harbor, they mentioned an unnamed Negro mess attendant who had manned a machine gun and fired on Japanese aircraft. They didn't use his name. They didn't describe what he had actually done. They certainly didn't call him a hero. It took months of pressure, months of questions from the black press, before the Navy finally confirmed that the mess attendant was Doris Miller from Waco, Texas. Even then, the recognition came slowly, grudgingly, as if the very idea of a black hero was too dangerous to fully acknowledge. Miller was awarded the Navy Cross in May 1942, the first black sailor to ever receive the honor. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself pinned the medal to Miller's chest aboard the USS Enterprise, and the moment was captured in photographs that would travel around the world. But even in that moment of recognition, there was a bitter truth beneath the surface. Miller was being honored for his bravery, yes, but he was also being sent back to the galley. The Navy promoted him to mess attendant first class, then to ship's cook third class. But they never made him a gunner. They never gave him the combat position he had proven he deserved, because the policy hadn't changed. Black men could be heroes, apparently, but they still couldn't be warriors. They could save a ship, but they couldn't serve on it as equals. Doris Miller didn't complain. He didn't rage against the injustice. He did what so many black Americans of his generation did. He continued to serve with dignity, continued to believe that his sacrifice mattered, continued to hope that things would change. He went on a war bond tour, standing on stages across America, helping to raise millions of dollars for the war effort. A living symbol of heroism that the country desperately needed. People came to see him, black and white alike, to shake his hand, to hear him speak, to understand that courage had no color. But when the tour was over, Miller went back to sea. Back to the galley. Back to serving food and cleaning up, even though he had proven himself in combat in a way that most sailors never would. He was assigned to the USS Liscum Bay, an escort carrier operating in the Pacific. And on November 24th, 1943, less than 2 years after he had become a national hero, a Japanese submarine fired a torpedo that struck the Liscum Bay and detonated her ammunition stores. The ship exploded in a fireball that could be seen for miles. She sank in 23 minutes. 644 men died, including the ship's captain and nearly the entire crew. Doris Miller was among them. He was 24 years old. His body was never recovered. The ocean that he had once saved others from became his grave. And America lost one of the bravest men who ever wore the uniform. A man who had fought not just the enemy, but the prejudice of his own nation, and never stopped serving anyway. The official word came to his parents in Waco: killed in action, lost at sea. Another name on the growing list of American dead. But Doris Miller's story didn't end with his death. It couldn't. Because what he had done on that December morning in 1941 was bigger than one man, bigger than one battle. He had shattered a myth that was as old as America itself. The myth that black men lacked the courage to fight. The myth that they couldn't be trusted in combat. The myth that their place was in service roles, supporting the real warriors but never joining them. Miller had proven all of that wrong in the span of a few minutes. And his example, his courage, his refusal to accept the limitations placed on him, helped to crack open a door that had been sealed shut for generations. After Pearl Harbor, after Miller's story became public, the pressure to change the Navy's policies became impossible to ignore. The black press hammered away at it. Civil rights leaders demanded reform. Even some white officers who had seen with their own eyes what black sailors could do began to speak up. Slowly, painfully slowly, the barriers began to fall. In 1942, the Navy began accepting black men for general service, not just mess duty. By 1944, the first black officers were commissioned. And in 1948, 7 years after Miller's heroic stand, President Truman signed an executive order desegregating the entire U.S. military. None of it happened fast enough. None of it erased the injustice that Doris Miller and thousands of other black servicemen faced, but it happened. And it happened in part because a young man from Texas refused to accept that his country's battle wasn't his to fight. He picked up that gun even though he wasn't supposed to. He defended his ship even though he hadn't been trained. He became a hero even though the system was designed to prevent him from ever being seen as one. And in doing so, he changed not just the Navy, but the nation. Today, there are memorials to Doris Miller across America. A Navy frigate was named in his honor, the USS Miller, the first ship in the fleet to be named for a black sailor. There are streets named after him, schools that bear his name, monuments that commemorate what he did. In 2020, the Navy announced that a new Ford-class aircraft carrier, one of the most powerful warships ever built, would be named the USS Doris Miller, a carrier, the crown jewel of naval power, named for a mess attendant who was never supposed to fight. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Doris Miller isn't found in monuments or ships. It's found in the generations of black Americans who served after him, who fought in Korea and Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, who became pilots and generals and admirals, who proved over and over again what Miller had proven that December morning. That courage doesn't see color. That heroism doesn't require permission. That when the moment comes, when everything is on the line, what matters is not what someone else says you can do, but what you know in your heart you must do. Doris Miller knew. When the bombs were falling and his ship was dying, when the chaos was absolute and the fear was real, he knew that he had to act. Not because anyone ordered him to, not because anyone expected him to, but because he was a sailor, and his brothers needed him, and his country needed him. Even if his country didn't fully recognize him as a citizen with equal rights, he acted anyway. He fought anyway. He became a hero anyway. And in that act of defiance, in that moment of pure courage, he didn't just save his ship. He didn't just shoot down enemy planes. He saved something more important. He saved the idea that America, for all its flaws and failures, could change, that it could become better, that it could live up to the ideals it claimed to represent even when it fell so painfully short. Doris Miller never got to see the fully integrated military. He never got to see black officers commanding ships and leading squadrons. He never got to see an aircraft carrier bearing his name. He died in the water in the dark, fighting a war for a country that still treated him as a second-class citizen. But he believed that his service mattered. He believed that his sacrifice would mean something. He believed that one day the door he helped to crack open would swing wide and the men and women who came after him would walk through it into a better world. And he was right. That's the crazy thing. That's the part of the story that makes it all worthwhile despite the pain and the injustice and the loss. He was right. The door did open, the change did come. Not fast enough, never fast enough, but it came. And it came because Doris Miller, a 22-year-old mess attendant from Waco, Texas, decided in a moment of crisis that he would not be defined by what others said he couldn't do. He would be defined by what he did. And what he did was extraordinary. He stood behind that gun with bombs falling around him and planes screaming overhead and his ship sinking beneath his feet, and he fought. He fought with everything he had. He fought like the warrior he always was, even when his country refused to see him as one. And in those few minutes of sustained fire and that desperate defense of a dying ship, he showed the world something it desperately needed to see, that heroism lives in unexpected places, that courage doesn't wait for permission, that sometimes the people we overlook, the people we underestimate, the people we push aside because of prejudice or fear or ignorance, are exactly the ones who will save us when everything falls apart. The men on the USS West Virginia never forgot what Doris Miller did. The survivors talked about it for the rest of their lives, told their children and grandchildren about the mess attendant who became their guardian angel that terrible morning. Some of them had never seen a black man as an equal before. Some of them had grown up in the segregated South, absorbing the same poisonous ideas about racial superiority that the Navy's policies reflected. But after Pearl Harbor, after watching Miller man that gun and fight like hell to save them, something changed in their hearts. They knew what they had seen. They knew who had saved them. And they never forgot. That's the power of courage. It changes minds. It opens hearts. It breaks down walls that seemed permanent and unmovable. Doris Miller didn't give speeches about civil rights. He didn't march in protests or write editorials. He just did his job. And when the moment came, he did more than his job. He did what heroes do. He gave everything he had, everything he was for the people around him. And that's the legacy. That's what survives long after the ships have rusted away and the battles have been forgotten. The example of one man who refused to accept limitations, who saw a gun that needed firing and fired it, who saw people who needed saving and saved them, regardless of what the rulebook said he was allowed to do. Doris Miller's crazy idea wasn't actually crazy at all. It was the sanest thing anyone did that day. When the world is exploding around you and death is raining from the sky, you don't worry about regulations. You don't think about what color uniform you're supposed to wear or what rank you're supposed to hold. You just fight. You fight for your brothers, for your ship, for your country, for the simple human conviction that life is worth defending. That's what Miller understood. That's what he showed us. And that's why his story 8 decades later still has the power to move us, to inspire us, to remind us that the measure of a person has nothing to do with the opportunities they're given and everything to do with what they do, with the moment they're in. Doris Miller was given a mop when he deserved a rifle. He was given a galley when he deserved a gun turret. He was given the status of a servant when he deserved the respect of a warrior. But when the moment came, when history pivoted on a handful of desperate minutes in Pearl Harbor, he took what he needed and became what he always was. A hero. An American hero. A hero whose courage transcended the barriers of his time and helped to build a better future for everyone who came after. That's not a crazy idea. That's the truth. And it's a truth worth remembering, worth passing on to every generation that follows. Because the fight for equality, for justice, for recognition doesn't end. It continues in every era, in every struggle, in every person who refuses to be limited by someone else's prejudice. Doris Miller fought that fight on the deck of the USS West Virginia with a gun in his hands and fire in his heart. And he won. Not just the battle, but something bigger. He won a place in history. He won the respect that should have been his from the beginning. He won the right to be remembered not as a mess attendant, but as a warrior, as a hero, as an American who loved his country enough to fight for it, even when his country didn't love him back. That's courage, that's sacrifice. That's the kind of story that deserves to be told and retold until everyone knows the name Doris Miller and what he did on that Sunday morning when the world changed forever. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive, stories of courage that transcended hatred, of heroism that changed history. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about the heroes in your own family, the veterans whose stories deserve to be remembered. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of black heroes whose courage changed the course of history, whose sacrifices paved the way for the freedoms we enjoy today, whose names should never be forgotten. Because when we remember them, when we honor them, when we tell their stories, we're not just looking back at history. We're keeping alive the values they fought for. We're continuing the work they began. We're ensuring that their legacy lives on in every generation that follows. Doris Miller deserves that. And so do the countless other black heroes whose stories are still waiting to be told.